Hello, jazz players. Welcome back. This is video number 2 in my 5 areas of jazz study series of videos. Today we're going to be talking about listening in the context of jazz improvisation. For whatever it is you want to do in your life, in a creative sense, you absolutely must be submerged in that environment. You cannot just be separate from that world and create stuff that belongs in that world. Okay? So, for example, if you want to write novels and you've never read a novel in your life, that's probably not going to go very well. If you want to write poetry, you need to be submerged into the world of poetry, reading poetry all the time. If you want to be a painter, then you need to be looking and studying other people's paintings. Even in the world of programming, if you want to learn how to code, the best way to do that is to be looking at other people's code. Look at their, and then not just their code, but also the end result, the software that they're developing and stuff like that. You cannot create in an idiom that you're not part of. And for jazz improvisation, that means listening to people who are improvising jazz. All right? So that's what this video is about. We're talking about how to become part of this world through your ears. It's one of the most important things that you can do. Now, let me stress this real quick before we move on. We're going through 5 areas, and this is the first of the 5 areas. Now, these are not prerequisites for each other. I'm not saying that you must first listen. No, I'm saying that you must always listen. First and last, okay? The listening never stops. You don't stop listening just because now you've got it or something, okay? So no, we're not talking about these as prerequisites. There are 5 areas of study that we do all the time. Sometimes we might shift heavy on one side and less on the other side, and then it'll shift around again. But we're doing all 5 of them all the time, okay? So the first one we're talking about is listening. Now, there's 2 different kinds of listening. There's active listening and there's passive listening, and they are both equally important for different reasons. The passive listening, I believe passive listening, it reaches your subconscious faster. I think, when I was in high school, I lived in El Paso, and at night, after my normal bedtime, I can't remember what that was, probably 9 or 10 o'clock at night, the local radio station used to play jazz all night. So I had a little crystal radio that I would put underneath my pillow, and I would listen to Charlie Parker and those guys late at night while I'm sleeping. Now that's the ultimate in passive listening. Obviously, I'm not paying attention because I'm asleep, right? Now, maybe on a subconscious level, I'm paying attention. But that's the point, isn't it? We're trying to listen without listening. So you can do passive listening while you're driving. I wouldn't recommend during homework, unless it's homework that can be done that way. If you're doing math or something like that, I can't see that. But maybe, for me, that won't work. Maybe that'll work for you. You can, while you're cleaning your room, doing chores outside, whatever, you can, in today's world, you just put the earbuds in. And let me caution you there, don't play the music so loud that you ruin your ears, please. Okay, be careful about that. If you want to be a musician, take care of your ears. Okay, so be sensitive to that kind of thing. And also, it's best to choose open air listening over earbud listening. I just say earbuds for outside because you're going to be moving around so much. So, now, passive listening can be broken up into 3 different categories based on why you're listening. So you could use the listening, the passive listening, to become familiar with the history of jazz. You know, in today's world, we have playlists, right? You can learn the history of jazz, learn the different eras that we have. You know, you have the early jazz, we have the what we today call Dixieland, you have the swing era, and each one of those eras, you can break them down, make a different playlist for each one of those eras. And then spend time passively listening to playlists of those different eras. It's a wonderful way to learn the history without having to learn the history. All right? So that's one type of passive listening, is to do it more historically. Then we have what I would call doing it for technical reasons. For example, if you're struggling with fourths, there's jazz out there that's really fourth heavy. We call it chordal, Q-U-A-R-T-A-L, chordal harmony, chordal melody. And that's, most traditional music is based on thirds, but this music is based on fourths. And if that's something that you're struggling with, the best way to deal with it is by listening to music that does that. Okay, so that's a great way to do this. Another example of that is if you're struggling with Latin rhythms in your improv, then listen to that stuff, right? And I'm talking passively. So I think you actually, and for these kind of things, you actually get more benefit listening passively. Now, I have to clarify there, we're talking about hours and hours and hours of passive listening. Thousands of hours, tens of thousands of hours over a lifetime, over years, and not a lifetime. Anyway, so yes, but still, over a lifetime, you should continue this passive listening the rest of your life. What else? Playing outside, this should be passive listening. The more you passively listen to music that goes outside, the more comfortable it's going to sound to you if you want to do that kind of playing. Same thing with the opposite of that. If you're struggling to play inside, you know, if you get hired to play in a old style like Glenn Miller type band, or maybe in a Dixieland band, you can't be playing outside on those gigs. So what do? You listen to that music so that it becomes more natural to you. I have a story I like to tell. I think I already told it a little bit in one of the other videos I made. I got hired to play with the Guy Lombardo band one time, and it was one time because I didn't do so well. At the time, I was playing with salsa bands, and I was so deep into the salsa thing that when I got to the Guy Lombardo band, I was trying to anticipate everything. But what happened with that is I decided afterwards I would listen to more Guy Lombardo style music, right? And it worked. The next gig I had in that style, never with that band again, but the next gig I had in that style, I nailed everything, finally. And it was because I incorporated that listening into my regular routine. Yes, listening is part of my routine, by the way. So yeah. And there's a third category that we cannot neglect. It's the most important. So I said historic listening, technical listening, and the last one is for passive listening, stuff that you like, okay? You should have a playlist somewhere. You know, if you use Spotify or whatever, everyone's using streaming now, right? And you can set up your own playlists. Please make a playlist of stuff that you actually like. Otherwise, what are you doing? Okay, it's not, music never is just an academic effort, okay? You should be spending your entire life looking for the music that you enjoy most, okay? That's, these other two things, in fact, everything else we're going to talk about today, everything else, This is probably the most important. Listen to the stuff you like, okay? Please. Don't just make it an exercise. You'll thank me for that later. I'm absolutely certain you'll be happy that someone said, hey, amongst all these other things that you should be listening to, find what you like and listen to that too. All right? So that's passive listening. And then at the other extreme of the spectrum, and it is a spectrum, the active to passive listening thing, it is a spectrum. And there's not, there are things in the middle. And we're going to come back to the middle stuff later. Let's talk now about the active listening. On the top end of active listening is doing transcriptions. And the ultimate form of doing transcriptions is when you just listen and learn it without writing it down. Okay? That is the ultimate. The best musicians I've ever worked with in my life, that's how they do it. They don't even write the stuff down. That said, not every transcription you do should be done that way, because that takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. And sometimes, and this is something that Danny Garcia taught me in El Paso, Danny Garcia said, why are you writing out that whole solo? And I said, because I wanted to transcribe it. He says, what did you like about it? He said, I told him it was this one lick. He said, why didn't you just transcribe the one lick? I go, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. And he is right. If there's a lick that you like, doesn't mean you have to transcribe the whole solo. I don't know why I was thinking like that. So you can do bits and pieces like that, and without having to commit to the whole thing. So yeah, and I might do a separate video later on how to transcribe. Actually, part of what I do for a living today is transcriptions. Not the kind that we're talking about here today, but the process is the same. I get paid sometimes. Someone says, hey, my band is doing this. We need trumpet parts, or we need a horn section parts. Sometimes I do the whole band, charts for the whole band. And how do I do that? It's the same process as transcribing someone's solo. So I might do a video on that. If you guys want that, please ask, and I'll put that at the top of the list. It takes a little bit more effort, I think, than doing this, because I'll be doing it with screenshots and all that stuff. So it's a little bit more difficult to set up. So yeah, at the top end of listening is the transcriptions. Now, why are transcriptions so good, so important? Why are they so good for you? Now, the very most obvious thing that everyone talks about is the ear training, and that's part of it. I think that's a big part of it, but that's not the most important part of it. Okay, I think the most important part of it is submerging yourself into the nuances of that musician's playing. When I read a transcription that somebody else wrote and then listen to the recording, it doesn't sound anything like I would have played if I had just played the chart. Okay? So, and we're going to talk about, by the way, this is a tangent, but we're going to talk about written transcriptions. That's not what we're talking about today. I'm not against those transcriptions, but that's not a transcription. And by the way, when we're talking about that, we're not going to talk about, so transcriptions falls in two different categories. It falls in the listening category, but once you do a transcription, let's say you're writing one, practicing the transcription falls in a different category of those 5 areas of study. Okay? So we're just talking about right now hearing the transcription, hearing the guy's solo. Okay? So yeah, when we submerge ourselves into that nuance, you hear the vibrato, you hear the texture changes, the tone changes. You hear how those notes that the musician is playing is lining up with the rhythm section. I'm not I don't teach jazz. I'm going to say that right out now. I don't teach jazz according to what scale goes to what chord. I'm completely opposed to that. But I am very much into different sounds over different chords. Now, that may sound like the same thing, but it's not. And we'll talk about that later as we get deeper into this. So, now I've talked about the passive listening. I've talked about the ultimate, transcriptions being the ultimate active listening. But there's something that falls in the middle that is extremely important, and that's listening to, how am I saying this? That's listening on the gig. I say gig because I'm a pro. Maybe you're younger, so maybe you're a freshman in high school, you're in a jazz band with some seniors who are more ahead than you are. I think that is some of the most powerful listening, the most influential listening that you can do. And that's something I haven't said yet. The closer you get to live, the more powerful the listening becomes. All right? So listening on the radio as opposed to going to a live concert. Cezanne here in Houston, the best place to listen. Why? Because you're right there. And I mean literally right there. Right? When I'm playing at Cezanne, I'm always concerned that the water from my water key is going to drip into their drinks. That's how close we are. Okay? And if you're a trumpet player, that's where you should be sitting. When are you going to have an opportunity to be right in front of somebody's bill? Talk about absorbing and being, consumed with someone's sound. It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, it might sound better farther back, but in terms of the influence that it has on you, that's the place to be. You can do farther away any other time. But if you can sit in that front row, so to me, if you're on a gig with somebody, and I've played with so many wonderful, wonderful players, most of them you'd never heard of. Now, there are people like Dennis Dotson. Dennis Dotson's kind of famous, right, as a trumpet player. And there's other people like that. But the majority of the people that I've worked with who are worthy of studying their playing, you probably never heard of any of them, okay? And yet, those can often be the most important musicians that for you to listen to in your life, okay? Another famous one that I had the honor of sitting next to is Barry Lee Hall, and I'm going to put out a video. I call it my plunger story. And so Barry Lee Hall influenced my playing in you know what? I only had X number of rehearsals with him and 2 gigs. And it's out of proportion how much I learned from him in that short period of time. And in the same way, Dennis Dotson, I learned a tremendous amount of I don't want to call it information, but there's so much that I learned from him over all these years. I've been working with Dennis for, I guess, about 25 years. And yeah, that's going to rub off on you. And you know what? Now that I'm actually saying this and talking about Barry Lee Hall, that's what Barry Lee said in the rehearsal, that playing in Duke Ellington, all of that stuff, working with those guys rubbed off on him. Okay? So, and see, I think we hurt ourselves. I've never been a fan of hero worship, and it's pushed today. I think now that the greats, so many of them are passing away, I think the hero worship within the jazz world has risen to an all-time high, and I'm so opposed to that. I am so opposed to that. And I think what happens is we work so hard at transcribing the greats, and we neglect the guy that's sitting right next to us. And you know what? That's not hurting that person nearly as much as it's hurting you. You are in a place. You know why Barry Lee said he came back to town? He wanted to pass the torch. That's what he said. Barry was on the road with Duke Ellington almost all his life. And he came back to Houston to pass the torch. Okay? And you know, that's how this works. You get into a band and you work with somebody. And it doesn't have to be another trumpet player. If you're a trumpet player, I've learned from so many sax players, guitar players, piano players. And, you know, but that's where your most important listening is. You know, all these greats that we worship that way, the hero worship, that's where they got where they were, is by being influenced by the people who were sitting next to them. That's how that worked. Okay, it wasn't through, I mean, of course there was some through the albums and radio and stuff like that. But I promise you, what happened there on the gig was far, far more powerful. And I'm talking specifically about improvisation. That's when because you know what, you're hearing, instead of listening to the same album every day and hearing the same exact solo every time, you're playing in a band where you're hearing the same musician play the same tune, and then, of course, other tunes as well. But you're hearing one night one way that player played it, and then the next night the same player, same tune, but you're hearing something different now. And that goes on and on and on. And you begin having a three-dimensional understanding of that musician's improvisation. And I promise you, this two-dimensional stuff that you get from studying recordings, I'm not going to tell you don't do that. That's an important part of what we do as well. But I want to tell you that what you hear on even if you're in high school, like I said earlier, the person who's a senior and you're a freshman, or maybe you're in college, the graduates and the undergrads, you know, you have a lot more to learn from that person. And I can tell you that's how it was with me when I was in college, and high school for that matter. The guys who were ahead of me influenced me more than you can imagine. And I'm sure it's that way with you, but you know what? If you embrace that, instead of being distracted by the hero worship, and you embrace what's sitting there right in front of you, I promise you it will enhance your improvisation in ways that it'll be stuff that nobody else will be doing anywhere else. It will be you. See, that's who we are, by the way. Musically speaking, we are a culmination of all the influences that we've had. And the most powerful influences are those influences of the people who sit next to us on stage. Okay? I want to let that sink in a little bit. All right? So this is, when we talk about listening, we say, oh, yeah, listening. You know what? I have listening assignments on my website. If you ever want to go and do some of my students' listening assignments, you can go to eddylewis.com, and there, down the page a little bit, is a playlist that I make for my students so they can listen. It's got classical and jazz on it. And so I ask them every week, did you do your listening? And that should be the bare minimum, right? The listening thing, it's a whole world that you submerge yourself into. All right, so be thinking about that. That's what I have for listening. That's area number 1. This is the second video. We're going to do 5 more videos because there's going to be at the end a summary video, because I forgot to say some stuff in the first one. Anyways, all right. So if you have any questions, please do ask. I love talking about this stuff. And as always, if you want to hear more of these, please subscribe. And if you like what you just heard, please like it too, because that helps me out. I'm one of those struggling YouTubers. So, yeah, not really, but yeah, you can pretend I am. So yeah, God bless you guys, and we will see you on that next video.